Good morning. Welcome to Ron's Ramblings. This will be number 22, which is part 1 in the life of Abraham. You see on the screen the text from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 10, which tells us that Abraham, by faith, when he was called to go out into a land that he should receive as an inheritance, that he obeyed even though he didn't know where he was going. But it was by his faith that he journeyed there. And when he got there, he was living in the land as if it were a strange country. He dwelt in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob after him, who were heirs also of the promise that was made to him in Genesis chapter 12. He was looking for a city that had foundations, whose builder and maker was God. The account of Abraham's life, as it's revealed in the book of Genesis, is pretty familiar to most everyone, I think. His life from the time he was 75 years old until his death is detailed highly in Genesis chapters 12 through 25. However, the first 75 years of his life is covered in the span of only 7 short verses. His birth is mentioned in the genealogical record, and then in the next 6 verses after verse 27 in Genesis 11, we are told of his marriage to Sarai, his father taking him to Haran, I think, and God calling him to get out of his country and away from his family. We know he was named Abram by his father Terah, and much later God changes his name from Abram to Abraham, and he becomes the father of the Jews. And for hundreds of years after that, every Jewish person, even to this day I suspect, would love to be able to trace their lineage back to Father Abraham. Of course, after 70 A.D., when the temple was destroyed and all the records that were kept there, that's not possible. But Abraham was known as the father of the Jews. This is the same chronological chart that we have seen twice before. I want to look at it one last time, and I'm going to get out of the way where you can see the whole chart. It goes from the very beginning, which is Adam's life at creation, and it goes up almost 2,200 years down to the bottom of the chart where Abraham lives. Looking at the earth's history in round figures, we see that Abraham was born at the end of the first third of the world's history, 2,008 years after creation. Rounded off, that would be, let's say, 2,000 years. And then if we stop and consider from the time that Abraham died until the time that Jesus is born is another rounded off 2,000 years. And then, even though we live in 2020, from the time of Jesus until our present time, another rounded off 2,000 years. Not only do I find that interesting, I also find it interesting that Noah was the 10th name on the chart from the top, and Abraham was the 10th name down from Noah. 10 generations in each instance. I doubt that there's any significance in that, but I think I'm going to show you a thing or two that might be interesting to you. Look at the bottom of the chart to Abraham's line, and notice that Abraham was born 2,008 years after creation, as we said. Now look back up to Noah's timeline and note that Noah died on the extreme right-hand side of his timeline 2,006 years after creation, just 2 years before Abraham was born. Even though Abraham is 10 generations removed from Noah, because of Noah's long lifespan, Abraham was born only 2 years after Noah died. And then there's one other thing I want to show you on this chart before we take it away. Look at Shem's timeline, just under Noah. And notice again on the far right that Shem died 2,158 years after creation, which, if you do the math, shows us that Shem was alive for the first 150 years of Abraham's life. Abraham lived to be 175 years old, and the first 150 of those years he lived with Shem still alive on the earth. There's a lot to cover in Abraham's life, and we'll get to it as we go along. But let's try to fill in some history between the ark coming to rest on the mountains of Ararat and the time when Abram leaves Haran and starts for Canaan. These are some sources that I use when I do my research for lessons from the Old Testament, and I thought I would share them with you because it might help you to find some information when you look for it and don't know where it might be easily found. I think we're fortunate that we've got some sources like this that still exist for us today. These sources may not be 100% accurate. They certainly aren't in the canon, so we can't trust them as being inspired works. But they are Jewish records, and the Jews attempted to keep very good records, and I think they did. However, some of the stories that we find in these sources are not recorded stories in writing, so that they've stayed the same as they were passed down through the generations, but rather they were stories that had been told orally by mouth one generation to the next, and those stories passed down through time until finally someone wrote them down. Therefore, some of those stories may have some embellishments to them to make them sound good, or maybe they have some accounts that are thought to have taken place, but it isn't certain that they did. But nevertheless, the sources are there, and you can look at them and you can glean from them. Just be careful and make sure that you don't try to quote them as actual truth when they aren't. The first reference I use a great deal is Flavius Josephus' book, The Antiquity of the Jews. This is a complete history of the Jewish nation. Actually, it's a history from the Jewish standpoint, from the very beginning of the world, since he talks about creation in it, and goes all the way to modern times in the sense of his life. That is to say, he was recording even late in his life, and he records some things that happened in his lifetime. So it's a good source to look. And by the way, he is recognized among the Jewish community as one of the best and most accurate Jewish historians. The second source that I use is a website, a Jewish website called Shabbat.org. It contains, again, a wealth of information about all of the key events that existed at the time and that were in the Jewish scheme of things. And it talks about how being in the life of a Jew, the day-to-day things that go on, and how you handle them, those day-to-day events. So it's also a pretty good source if you want to know something about the Jewish religion at all. The third is a book that parallels the book of Genesis, although this is from the Jewish standpoint. They call it Lesser Genesis. It's an ancient religious work of about 50 chapters. It provides a lot of detail that's not found in the book of Genesis. It isn't recognized as being among those books in the canon, so again, it can't be quoted as being actual truth. But it is considered to be capable of being canonized by the Orthodox churches and most of the Jewish people. And so it's there and you can use it. You can download it, by the way, for free. If you Google it on the internet, you'll find it in PDF format, and it's free to download, and it's in English that you can read easily. It might give you some insight that you hadn't thought of before. But again, remember, it's not in the canon, so it isn't inspired work. But since the Bible picks up Abraham's life when he's 75 years old, and only 6 verses are used to bring his life to that point, we have to look elsewhere for his early life, and these sources help a great deal in that. So from this point, you've probably noticed as we've gone along, I've been using Abraham's name and sometimes calling him Abram. I'm gonna make a conscientious effort from this point to use the names that were given to them when they were born, Abram for Abraham and Sarai for Sarah. Their original names were given by their fathers, and I'm going to use those names. I'll probably mess up, and you can catch me in that, but that's my plan anyway. This map that you see on the screen shows Mount Ararat up in the upper portion of it, just to the left of the Caspian Sea. And there's been about a 350 year span of time between the time the ark rests on Mount Ararat and Abram is born. In Genesis chapter 8, verse 4, when it talks about the ark coming to rest, it says that it came to rest in the mountains, plural, of Ararat. We often make that be the top of Mount Ararat, and that may be accurate. After all, as we saw when we were studying Noah's life, it took several days, in fact weeks, after they came to rest on the mountain before they saw some mountaintops peeking out of the water. So most likely they had come to rest on the highest part there, which would have been Mount Ararat itself. But nevertheless, it is quoted and mentioned as being the mountains, plural, of Ararat, where the ark came to rest. And that's shown, as I said, on the upper right-hand part of the screen there next to the Caspian Sea. And since that area is where all that are in the ark are going to be released or let out of the ark, I thought it might be a good idea for us to kind of get an idea of what that terrain would be like and what the climate would be like at that time. Remember, when they went into the ark before the flood, everything was the same day after day after day. There was no rain, there was no storms, there was no bad days and good days. It was a good place to live, comfortable. You didn't need to wear coats. There were no seasons, wintertime and summertime. Every day was just the same. The land was plentiful. It grew good crops and easily. Yes, they had to work at it, but it produced well for them. And they had grown accustomed to that. And they get into the ark, and then a year later, when they come out of the ark, everything has changed. Now, I don't think immediately we went from that tropical climate that they knew to the seasons that we have today. That took years to do, and we talked about that as we covered the life of Noah. But still yet, if they decide to settle there, they're going to have to deal with that climate and with those mountains. And so I thought it might be a good idea for us to kind of get an idea of just what it would be like to live there if they chose to live there. And in order to do that, I Googled to find the exact latitude of the peak of Mount Ararat. And Google came up with a precise location that Mount Ararat exists at 39.7024 degrees north latitude. That's north of the equator. And then I put that figure into Google again and asked it to find me a city in the United States that would be real close to that, so that we could kind of get an idea better of what it was like. And Denver popped up, Denver, Colorado. And it gave the latitude for Denver as being 39.7392 degrees north latitude. And as you can see on the screen, that's a difference of actually 0.0268 degrees, 0.03 of 1 degree. And so I wondered just how far off that was. And quite frankly, it's not very far off. If you again Google how much a degree of latitude is, and then divide it by the figures that are up on that we had first, it comes out to just a little less than 1,000 feet. Let's say about 2 city blocks. So yes, Denver would be very likely the place that they would have the same climate as the place that they would be if they decided to stay on Mount Ararat. But as you know, they didn't stay there. You'll see down below Mount Ararat, down next to the Tigris River, that dark blue line. There's 2 dark blue lines on the map. That's the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And Tigris is the one on the top end, closest to Mount Ararat. And if you'll look there next to the Tigris River, you see I have labeled in the plains area the name Shinar. Genesis chapter 11 and verse 2 tells us that Noah came down from the mountain and dwelt in the plains of Shinar. Now Josephus tells us that all 8 souls came out of the ark, and they descended the mountains of Ararat, and then crossed to the plains and fixed their habitation there. I'm guessing it took a little time for them to get there. I used Google Earth in order to try to determine the distance between Mount Ararat's peak and where Shinar, the plains of Shinar, are. And it's a little difficult because those plains are pretty good size, and we don't know exactly where in that area they settled. So I picked a spot in about the middle, and it came out to about 200 or 225 miles, more or less southwest of Mount Ararat. And so I decided I would find where that would be in the United States, and so I went to Denver and I drew a circle 225 miles around it, and the largest city to the southwest of Denver that's in that area is Albuquerque, New Mexico. So that's a much warmer climate. It's down off of the mountains, although there are still some hills there in Albuquerque. Pretty much it's a plains area, and probably is very similar to the place that they settled and called home. God had told them to come to multiply and repopulate the earth, and they did that. And we're told by Josephus that after a while their number had increased to the point to where they began to have some trouble that developed between them. And he says, Josephus says, that God, seeing that trouble, instructed them to not stay together, but to venture out and establish colonies away from each other, which would provide more room for them. And I suspect that may have been one of the problems that they had, is everybody wanted to stay right there together, and each of them had their own ideas of how they wanted to deal with that and plant their crops and that sort of thing. So it would have been better for them to venture out from that place, and they did. And that helped things. I don't know how many people were alive at that time. We're talking about 8 people that came down the mountain, and we're talking about a time period that wouldn't have been all that long. So I didn't quite get the picture, I guess, of how long they were there. But the truth of the matter is they stayed there probably about 300 years, maybe even a little longer than that, before they moved further south and got close to the river. And so I thought, well, maybe we might use that chart that we did once before when we were wondering how many people there was alive on the earth that were going to perish when the flood came. The chart that we talked about is kind of I guess it's an estimate, for the lack of a better word, that helps us try to, let me get me off of here again so you can see the whole chart. And this is the first 200 years. It's pretty well self-explanatory, and we don't need to spend a bunch of time on it. I want you to notice, though, a couple of things. In the first line, where it shows Noah being 601 years old, that was in the year 1,657 years after creation. And over in column 3, I put a 1 there because that's the start. That's the very beginning when we talk about the population after the flood. But the thing I want to mention is, notice in the right-hand side, I listed the population as 6 rather than 8. And the reason I did that is because Noah and his wife did not have any more children. And therefore, the repopulation of the earth would have come through the 3 sons of Noah and their wives. So in order to keep the figures straight and not have the error double every 25 years, I put 6 in that column. And so that's going to be the basis for the population. And then look down to Peleg's time. I've got it highlighted on the screen. That is 100 years, halfway through this chart. And by that time, using that standard averaging method, there would have been 96 people after 100 years. And then the bottom of the chart, 200 years after the flood, there would have been 1,500 in round figures. And then this chart, the second part of the chart, takes us up even further And again, about halfway down, I have two lines highlighted. The first line that I have highlighted is 1,996 years after the flood, and that's when Peleg died. You remember when we discussed Noah's life, that it was in Peleg's lifetime that the earth was divided. It was the time when the Tower of Babel was being built, and God came down and destroyed that and confused the language of the people and then scattered them all over the face of the earth. Well, we might have wondered at that time just how many people there were to scatter all over the earth. As you will notice, that would be right at 325 years after the flood, and the world's population at that time was just a little bit under 50,000 people. So there was a significant number of them that were there. The next line is 25 years later, and that's approximately at the time of Abram's birth. And when Abram was born, the world's population would have doubled since it was 25 years later, and that would have been about 98,000 people in round figures. And then we said that Abram lived for 75 years before he was called by God to leave Haran and go to Canaan. Well, that 75 years is 3 of those 25-year doubling segments that we deal with. So the very bottom line of the chart that you see here is when Abram leaves, and he is 75 years old, which is 425 years after the flood. And as you can see, the world's population at that time was approaching 750,000 people. So the people began to populate the earth very quickly. And these figures may be a little conservative because Josephus says that the people flourished with new births at the time that they settled in the land of Shinar. So it may well have been a lot more people than this, but I felt like we needed to use some figures that are more or less conservative. May not be exactly accurate. We don't have any deaths figured into that as there would have been, and we're also not accounting for any periods of time when there may have been a lot more births than normal. But say roughly 750,000 people, and then 25 years later, that would be 1.5 million people, and then it just goes up from there rather quickly. This is the map again, and the reason I brought this map back up is because there were so many people. They needed more room, and they had began to branch out like Josephus said that God told them to do. And the direction that they went was toward Babylon. And you can see I've got Babylon written on there. Now, I want you to know that at the time that we're talking about, there was no Babylon. There was a city there, and it was named Babel, just like the Tower of Babel. In fact, that's where the Tower of Babel was built, and we're going to talk about that just a little bit later. But I've labeled it Babylon because that's what it was on the map, quite frankly. And I've also added the red dot down below what you see there. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But the people were beginning to move toward the rivers. Perhaps they needed a lot of water. And they settled in between the two rivers in most instances and along either side of the river. And so, as I said, Josephus believed that the people had a strong, flourishing population growth. once they got settled down below the plains of Shinar and had moved down into the river area. And by the way, in his Antiquity of the Jews, there was another thing that he said that I thought that caught my eye, and I think it's kind of important. He said that at the time that they were settled there, things were going so well for them that they did not recognize that their prosperity was coming from God, but rather they strongly believed it was coming through the work of their own hands and their own power, and they were beginning to wane in their belief of God and their dependence upon Him, because now we're talking 300 years after Noah's, after they came out of the ark, and Noah stayed up in the plains of Shinar and did not move down there with the rest of them as he lived out his life. So these people are several generations beyond Noah, and they are without his guidance and leadership, and so they were beginning to move away from God. And that brings up a character that I want to talk to you about, a man by the name of Nimrod. He is going to be a very negative effect on the people. You might recall that after the flood, Noah planted a vineyard, and he made some wine, and he became drunk. And during that time, his youngest son, Ham, came into the tent and saw that Noah was uncovered. And it is said that he looked upon his father's nakedness, and God was displeased with him because of that. You'll remember the other two sons backed in with a blanket behind them as they dropped over so that they did not see Noah's nakedness. The punishment that Ham received for having done that and having looked upon his father was that his children were to be servants of his brother's children. As time progressed, that took place, and Ham became pretty much a whole nation of servants that served the other two brothers. Genesis chapter 10 and verse 8 lists Nimrod as being the grandson of Ham. And it said there of Nimrod that he began to be a mighty one on the earth. He is described as being a mighty man, a mighty hunter, and verses 10 and 11 say that the beginning of Nimrod's kingdom was Babel in the land of Shinar, and that he went forth and he built cities of Asher, Nineveh, Rehoboth, and Calah in the land of Shinar. That indicates to me that Nimrod may have been the very first king, since it talks about his kingdom being established there, or the beginning of his kingdom being there in Babel. And he would have been an ambitious man and expanded his kingdom rather quickly. And it soon became apparent, I think, that he didn't plan to serve anyone. Instead, he wanted them to serve him. There's very little mentioned about Nimrod in the scriptures, but Josephus has a whole lot to say about him because of his ruthlessness and his idolatry. As a matter of fact, Josephus explicitly mentions him as being the one who excited the people to have contempt for God, to turn away from God and to begin to worship idols. And by the way, Josephus also says that Nimrod was the one that wanted to build the tower. And since his palace was there in Babel, right in the center of his kingdom, It was only natural for him to build the tower there, or to have it built. And so, if Josephus is correct, then it was Nimrod who wanted to build the Tower of Babel. The two people, Nimrod and Peleg, lived during the same periods of time. And in the scriptures, we read that it was during Peleg's lifetime that Tower of Babel was built, and that the earth was divided and the people were scattered. I'm not sure. I can only surmise that perhaps due to the nature of Nimrod trying to get the people to get away from God and to worship idols, and the evilness that he had, the ruthlessness that he had, God probably didn't want to use him as a reference, and so he chose Peleg, and during Peleg's lifetime, which would parallel the lifetime of Nimrod. But he used Peleg as the one to reference that event. As far as I can tell from all that I've been able to search and come up with, Peleg had nothing to do with the building of that tower. Oftentimes, when we read that it was during Peleg's lifetime that the tower was built, we always want to say, well, then he was one of the ones that were involved in it. I can't verify that at all. In fact, I rather doubt that he was. But anyway, there is something to be said about Nimrod. He was a real ruthless person. And once that scattering took place there from when the Tower of Babel was built, that was a real big put down for Nimrod, because politically that was it could have been his downfall. But rather than let it bother him, he chose to leave Babel and reestablish his kingdom elsewhere. And the place that he picked to go was Ur. Ur had already been in existence for about 100 years. It was built by a man by the name of Ur in the lineage of Christ. I think he was Arphaxad's son or grandson. I'm not sure exactly. And he is the one that built Ur. So the city was established, and Nimrod moved his kingdom down there. Now, the one thing that I need to mention, we hadn't said much about Terah, Abraham's father, but the truth of the matter is that Terah was associated with Nimrod. When Nimrod established his kingdom, he looked out for the wiser people, I guess, among him, and he picked Terah to be not his right-hand man, but to be one of his advisors and to manage portions of the activities that went on. And the longer they were together, the more trust that Nimrod placed in Terah. So when this Tower of Babel was built and then God destroyed it, and Nimrod felt it necessary to move, he moved down to Ur and reestablished his kingdom down there, and he took Terah with him. Terah, now, remember, is Abram's father. This is a different map, and it shows perhaps some things that we need to look at. That yellow area that you see there, kind of disregard that New Babylonian Empire label that's in the top portion of it. That's at a later time, but the same map was used in a lesson dealing with that. But Chaldea, as you see labeled in the lower right, or the Chaldees, as it's sometimes mentioned, that was the nation that existed, and it actually wasn't as large as this yellow area shows. Chaldea went from its northernmost limit would have been about the city of Babel, or Babylon as it's listed on here. And it covered the areas around the river down to the Persian Gulf, and also a little bit to the east. And that is, it's where Ur is located in Chaldea, and that's why it's called Ur of the Chaldees. Later on, the Chaldeans merged with the Babylon people, and it becomes the Babylonian Empire, and they do end up taking all of that yellow area that you see on there, but that's later on. According to the Book of Jubilees, it is stated that Ur, the city of Ur, was founded about 1,688 years after creation, and that it was one of the grandsons of Arphaxad that did that, a man by the name of Ur. And so, as I said, it had been in existence actually longer than the city of Babel was. Maybe not long, maybe 50 or 100 years later. Anyway, that's where Nimrod moved his headquarters. His palace was moved from Babel about 80 miles kind of south, almost due south, a little bit to the east, on the Euphrates River. And he took, as I said, Terah with him. This is kind of a family tree of Terah's life, and he had 3 sons, as you see: Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran is the oldest of those. This is real similar to what is said about Noah when he was 500 years old and he begot 3 sons. And those 3 sons were listed, and that's what it is here. In each case, the son that was being tracked as part of the lineage is always mentioned first, and that's why Shem was mentioned first, and Ham and Japheth were after his name. Here, Abram is going to be the lineage through which Christ comes, and so he is mentioned first. In both cases, the eldest son is mentioned last. It was Japheth, the son of Noah, who was the oldest of the 3 sons, and here it is Haran that is the oldest of the 3 sons. Nahor and Abram were younger than him. In fact, the order would be Haran, the oldest, Nahor, the middle son, and Abram, the youngest son. As soon as they get to Ur, Haran, I don't say as soon. Shortly after, let's say, they get to Ur, Haran dies. He had 3 children. Only one is listed there, Lot, because the lineages are the males and not the females. But he had 2 daughters. Milcah was one of the daughters, and Sarai was the other daughter. And we're going to find later, and you probably already know it, Nahor, Terah's middle son, married Haran's daughter Milcah. And later on in that, Abram, the youngest son of Terah, married the other daughter of Haran, Sarai. And since Haran had died there, Lot was kind of taken in by Terah's family. And then when they leave and start toward Canaan, Abram takes Lot with him. And we'll talk about that when that happens. But it wasn't unusual for that kind of a thing to go along, especially when Lot would have been the brother of Abram's wife. And again, we'll talk about that later. I want to finish this first part, though, by telling you a story that I found. It's one of those stories that passed down through the generations, and as I said, it may have been embellished a little bit, but I want to tell it to you anyway because it gives us a little bit of an insight between the relationship that went on between Terah and Nimrod and Abram. And this story begins before Abram is born. And Terah is one of the people that handles the idol worship in the palace, or in the religious sections of the palace of Nimrod's kingdom there in Ur. And he had some astrologers, Nimrod did, and those astrologers had been looking into the sky, and they noticed a new star, a star that they had not seen before. And they began to look into that, and I don't know how they did that. I don't know what astrologers did back in those days. But they came to the conclusion that new star had a meaning. And the meaning that they came up with was that the son who was about to be born was destined to become a chief and the father of a mighty nation. It's true, but how they came up with that, I don't know. The one that was about to be born was Abram. Terah's wife at the time was well over 8 months pregnant and was due to deliver just within a week. And so when those astrologers came up with their conclusion that the son that was about to be born was going to be a chief and a mighty father, a mighty nation, they told Nimrod about that. Excuse me. And Nimrod immediately believed that's going to be a threat to him because he was the one in power. And therefore, he wanted to ensure that didn't happen. And he decided to put a plan in place whereby that child would not live. So he sent men to all of the households around that might have a child that they knew that the mother was pregnant. And so some of those astrologers went and camped at Terah's house. And when the son was born, they told Nimrod about it. Now, once that happened, Nimrod asked Terah to bring the newborn baby to the palace for him to see. And I guess perhaps Terah may have heard some of the things that were being said, maybe some of the rumors that were going around, I don't know. Maybe he just suspected Nimrod, knowing his character, would be doing something bad. He tried to get out of bringing Abram to see Nimrod, but that didn't work. Nimrod was insistent, and it was necessary for that to happen. So Terah made a plan. He had his wife take the baby, Abram, and hide him in a cave. And it just so happened that one of Terah's servants had also given birth to a child, and it was a male child, on the same night that Abram was born. And so he took that child, the servant's child, and that's the one that he brought to the palace, and Nimrod saw. And when Nimrod reached out to take the child, he killed him with his bare hands. Just killed it right there. Now, according to the story, Abram remained hidden in the cave for a few days until arrangement could be made, and they took Abram, the baby, north to Shem's house. Shem at that time would have been living in Noah's house, because remember now, Noah died just barely 2 years before Abram was born. So since the child Abram has been born, Noah is dead, and his estate is being settled, and Shem is kind of the administrator of that, I guess. I don't know. And he had taken his residence there. And according to this legend, they brought the baby Abram to Shem. And Shem took Abram in, and over the next 15 to 18 years, he taught him about Jehovah. And so Abram learned to serve God directly from Shem, if this story is true and authentic. Once he was an adult, Abram returned to Ur. No one recognized him. He lived with his family, but he lived there as if he were a distant relative that had come to visit. And no one suspected anything. They all thought that the baby that Terah's wife was born to Terah's wife, but they knew that baby was dead, or they thought he was. And so they didn't give any second thought to Abram being there. And while he was there, of course, he saw in the house of his father, who, remember, was into idolatry and was one of the people that worked with the idols in the palace areas. And it upset Abram to no extent, because his dad had so many idols there in the house. And he had talked to his dad on 2 or 3 occasions trying to get him to turn away from the idolatry, and trying to tell him that the idols, they couldn't do anything. They were just rock and wood, and they had even been chiseled or formed by a human. They're nothing. They can't move or do anything. And Terah, like a lot of people, I guess, just kind of let it go in one ear and out the other. Well, one day, don't know how much later than that, but at one day, while Terah was gone, Abram took an axe, and he cut up and destroyed all of the idols in Terah's house, left them lay scattered out on the floor, pieces just all around. But he hadn't touched the largest idol in the house. He left it as it was. And all the others are just in pieces on the floor, scattered around the house. And when Terah comes in and sees that, he suspected that Abram had done that. And he came to Abram and asked him, what have you done, and why have you done this? And Abram said, I didn't do it. But what happened was that an offering had been left, and they got into an argument over the offering, and they weren't willing to cooperate with each other, and so they began to fight over the offering. And it got to be so bad that the big idol there took an axe and just chopped all the other idols up and just left them strung out all over the floor there like that. Well, Terah exclaimed that type of a thing is not possible. He said, idols can't quarrel with each other. They can't fight. They can't even move. And then he stopped, and he realized that his son had tricked him into admitting that idols were nothing. Maybe that was the start of his turning away from the idols. Eventually he does. Abram convinces him to turn away from the idolatry, and he does. He rejects his idols. Not long after that, his wife dies. Those two things are probably what causes him to decide to leave Ur. He's mourning his wife. He has turned away from idolatry, which, by the way, caused a great deal of animosity between he and Nimrod, because he refused to continue to help Nimrod in the palace with the idols, and Nimrod did not like that. And between the mourning over his wife and the state of the situation there, he figured he was probably be better off to leave. And so he decides to leave, and he takes his family with him. And that will end this session, and we'll take up here in the next section. I hope you have a good day. Good afternoon.